Greetings, imagination connoisseurs. Once again, it is I, your Duke of Dope Discourse, Robert Meyer Burnett. I invite you to watch and listen to the Designing Hollywood podcast, brought to you by Martika Ibarra and the great, legendary Hollywood costume designer, Marilyn Vance. I am afforded the wonderful opportunity of co-hosting the show. If you are interested in the magic of Hollywood, the design of Hollywood, the clothes of Hollywood, watch the Designing Hollywood podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts from, or find the video version on YouTube. That's right, the Designing Hollywood podcast. Why would you ever want to miss it? Especially if you love the movies.
Robservations with Robert Meyer Burnett.
Well, greetings, imagination connoisseurs. Once again, it is I, your Duke of Dope Discourse, your master of fun and wonder, your viceroy of verisimilitude, your archbishop of Banterbury, your evangelist of the imagination. By the way, this was drawn by Mark Chure, the late, great Mark Chure, and whenever I see this picture, I think of him. And, of course, your existential Mr. Rogers. That's right, me, Robert Meyer Burnett, and this is Robservations, episode number 807. I know, I keep promising that I'm going to step up the pace. Haven't done it yet, and I apologize for that. It's all on me. You know, between the streaming I'm doing, the videos I'm doing, the other extracurricular activities I'm doing, writing, such things, I've been slacking off. And, you know, you should bend me over a chair and spank my bare bottom and tell me to get with the program. But I promise, I'm going to step up that. We're going to bring Robservations back on a daily basis, I swear to God. By hook or by crook, we will. Now, before I start today's topic, you can send me a letter. And obviously, as people who've watched Robservations since 2018 know, part of this show is feedback. It's reading letters from you. You imagination connoisseurs, you members of this, the Post-Geek Singularity community. And sometimes I get a letter that just makes me chuckle. And I thought I would read it right off the bat, because I think it'll make you chuckle too. And, you know, Reese wrote it, and it's a great Friday night letter. And I actually liked it. The subject headline is Movies on Drugs. This comes from Reese. Hey, Rob. Last night, high as a kite, I decided to watch Neon Genesis Evangelion, the end of Evangelion. And here's the caveat. I watched it without having seen a single episode of the TV series. But this was a deliberate choice. You see, I'm off work on holiday. Holiday for me being spending 10 days in bed, smoking a lot of weed, and watching a lot of movies. And I thought, fuck it, I want something trippy. Let's watch Evangelion. I am of the belief that anyone can get something from any form of media, that a person could watch The Return of the King, having seen no other Rings films, and still enjoy it. That our lived experience makes viewing anything unique. So, what does it matter if I haven't seen the preceding story leading up to this finale? In some cases, doing this is vital for our own mental health. Here's looking at you, Picard Season 2, where I skipped 5 episodes and just went straight to the end. Week by week, that show was slowly killing me, and I was intrigued to see just how bad it would all get. But that is a story for another day. So, Evangelion. I was curious to see what it would be like as just a standalone movie. I smoked a ton of weed, and my God, I was not prepared for what I saw. Incredible. What a crazy and mental and existential, but beautiful fucking trip. I loved it. So my question for you is, do you have any cool stories about times you've experienced movies on drugs? One day I'll tell you about the time I watched Star Trek the Motion Picture on a hallucinogen, and it was positively orgasmic, quite literally. And my second question is, have you ever experienced and enjoyed a show or movie, having missed a lot of the context surrounding it? Maybe watched a sequel before the original, or jumped into a show 4 seasons in, or like me, watched a movie that is a follow-up to a TV show, but I haven't watched the show. Keep making geekdom sexy. Big love. Reese. Well, Reese, first of all, thank you for that. That's a great letter. I love that letter. Thank you. First of all, Evangelion, I love that was your choice. Now, I would like to direct you. I almost wish that you'd watched the fourth. Now, that they have been doing, there's 4 now remake movies where they've gone back and reimagined the series as a series of 4 feature films. And the 4th film, let me tell you, I can't imagine what it would be like to watch that 4th film stoned. But to be honest, I am not a fan of watching movies altered. Only because when I watch movies, it's hard to explain, but I think I watch movies multi-dimensionally. And I don't mean like I'm watching them in a different dimension. I mean, I'm watching them like in addition to the story, I'm looking at the how it was made, the editorial, the shot choices. I'm watching it all, and I'm consciously aware of all these things kind of at the same time. And that's not, so I guess it's a skill I've picked up over the years, actually being an editor, and it doesn't hamper my enjoyment of the film. Usually if I like a movie, though, I want to see it 3 or 4 times. I mean, I did go see things like when I was in high school. My friend Adam Carl and I, we skipped the homecoming dance. We didn't take anybody, and we went and saw Pink Floyd The Wall, and we were stoned out of our gourds, and it was a fantastic experience. I really did enjoy it. And there have been times I did get stoned once and saw Dune, but these are movies I got stoned after I'd seen them. But when I see a film the first time, I don't usually like to see it altered, just because I like to concentrate on the movie. So sadly, I have not ever done that. However, I have watched things that I hadn't seen, say, the first part of and jumped in later, sometimes only just to see, like, if I know that I'm not that particularly interested in a franchise, I'll sample it or something like that. I've done that a lot with sitcoms, because you can jump in anywhere with a situation comedy, because I'm not a big sitcom fan, only because, I understand the humor, but really it's just variations on a theme, and there's not much going on cinematically in a sitcom, so it's hard for me to muster up much enthusiasm unless I want to look at some deft comedy writing or something like that. But I'll tell you, a great experience I had watched Doctor Who, and I have a man crush on John Barrowman. I liked Captain Jack. I liked Doctor Who, but I'd never watched Torchwood. Never watched it, and I'd never watched the series. And the third, so there were 2 seasons of Torchwood. Then the 3rd season was the 5-episode Children of Earth. Never seen it. People had said, you should watch Children of Earth. Yeah, it's really good, Rob. You should check it out. So I actually bought Children of Earth on Blu-ray. And I don't know, I was working probably, I want to say I was working on the Star Trek, The Next Generation, and Enterprise Blu-rays. This is like, I want to say it was like 10 years ago. Pretty much it was like 10 years ago. And we were working these insane hours because we had so much work we had to do and we didn't have enough time to do it. But I had bought the disc and I went home and it was like 1 o'clock in the morning. And I used to like to unwind, glass of whiskey and maybe an American Spirit Yellow or 2. I don't smoke anymore, but and watch something. And I put on Children of Earth, and I have to say, I was blown away. It's 5 of the finest hours of science fiction television. I mean, it combined all the things I loved: really heady sci-fi, conspiracy theory, governmental shenanigans, military involvement, aliens, and I watched all 5 hours. And I totally got it. I mean, I didn't understand the relationships between the characters. But, if you're a student of media and you've watched plenty of television and read plenty of books, read plenty of comics, it's easy to sort of catch up because you'd be surprised at just how many times storytelling tropes are used. And if you've consumed as much media as I have over the years, it's easy to jump in and know what's going on. So I understood the setup of the Torchwood organization, and just by osmosis, I'd understood that this was an organization set up by the Queen, like in the late 1800s, and they were in Cardiff, Wales, by the sea. So there was things that I was able to just get up to speed on very quickly. But I was, man, I was blown away. And, I've said this before on the show, but one of the things that has always sort of bummed me out, like I've read a lot of horror, dark fantasy, a lot of horror fiction, and even science fiction shows, and whenever science fiction novels or whatever, or even mystery thrillers, one of the things that has always been a pet peeve of mine, especially if you've devoured a lot of these things, is the story is really intriguing till 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through the story, and then the revelation of what's really going on happens, and then the good guys have to defeat the bad guys once the plot is revealed. And unfortunately, that's just how storytelling works. And I've often found that I've grown tired of, once the revelations come and everything's going down, I grow tired of the perfunctory battle to get to the end of the story. I mean, I'll stick with it. But when the revelation happened in Torchwood Children of Earth and you find out what's really going on, it was so monstrous. I mean, to me, that I'm like, oh my God. Like I truly was. It was one of those moments where I was really shocked, and I loved it. I mean, I loved it. And it was fantastic. It's got great characters, great acting. I mean, Peter Capaldi's in it. He plays a government functionary. He was great, and he later became the Doctor. But it's tremendous, and that was something I easily was able to figure out. And I have to tell you, when I went back and then I did buy, now I've got the full series on Blu-ray. But when I went back and watched Torchwood seasons 1 and 2, I was actually kind of disappointed because tonally it was all over the place. It was really it was strange because by watching Children of Earth first, it maybe wasn't. I mean, I was expecting a much different kind of a show, but I still enjoyed it. It was still fun, but Children of Earth was on a whole new level. And then, of course, they brought Torchwood to America, and they made Miracle Day, which, boy, what a great premise, and what disappointing execution. There's a head scratcher of a show. Maybe if I smoked a lot of reefer, I would have been able to like that show better than I did, because wow. Who would have ever thought there's a giant urethra that goes through the middle of the earth? I didn't, but it could have been better. But that's sort of that's my thoughts on that. And Evangelion is, for those of you who are interested in Japanese animation, it's a tremendous series. And now we have you have the series, and it ended twice, 2 different endings, and then you can go back and you can watch the movies. And I have to say, the movies, I quite like the films, and the 4th film is quite the experience, I have to say. So, highly recommended. Check that out. But I want to thank you for writing in, Reese. That was quite the letter, and thank you for writing in. If you want to send me letters, you can go to the website, postgeeksingularity.com, and you can send me letters there, and I will read them here on Robservations. And since I've been reading these, to Jason S. says, he sends in a tip, and he says, "Hello, Robert San, who is known as the alien prince that never was. I checked out the Cock Rings of Power, and compared to the House of the Dragon, I'd say it's more of a power bottom. Long live the king. May the goof be with you." Well, Jason, thanks for supporting the channel. And yeah, I read I read an article in Forbes today that it really eviscerated Rings of Power. I have to say, I've been quite disappointed by Rings of Power. A silly goose sends in a tip and says, "Rob, I want to elaborate my thoughts on For All Mankind. I think season 1 has been the best season thus far. It was the most grounded. The 60s and 70s goings on of NASA are endlessly fascinating. My favorite character was Gordo, a tragic, heroic character." Yeah, I mean, I can understand that. I mean, as we've gotten, I would say probably, I think season 1, as far as pacing, was probably overall maybe the best season. I thought season 2 dipped a little too much into the melodrama, but it was redeemed by the end. The last episode of season 2 is one of the finest hours of science fiction television of the last 20 years. I loved it. And I did love, I loved season 3 quite a bit. And I really liked how they leaned into historical events. I liked what they did with Oklahoma City and how they applied that to what was going on, which made sense to me. And but overall, I think the show it's tremendous. It's my favorite science fiction show on the air. I mean, The Expanse, I really like The Expanse, but the latter couple of seasons sort of petered out for me. The Inaro storyline just kind of went on too long. And I understand it was a function of the books. I really don't understand why they're not doing the 3 more seasons. I mean, I understand money-wise and things like that, but why not just finish the show? Just go all the way, which will be good. But so anyway, I wanted to talk about, go figure, Star Trek. And there's an article that dropped on Slate.com that I wanted to read, and then there's another article from Ars Technica I wanted to read. And I wanted to delve into those. But before, let me just read these 2 super chats. Magic Case says, Moon Age Daydream is an odd movie, but I like it. Now, I haven't seen it. I saw some of it. I saw an extended preview of it at CinemaCon. It's coming out from Neon, or it's out from Neon. And I thought it was really, really interesting. I was wondering, could they sustain that for a whole couple of hours? But I'm a huge Bowie fan. I'm adding my Bowie figure to my 6-scale band shelf. By the way, Ebony Maw is leaving and going into the Magic Cases. But, I'll have Bowie and he's playing a sax, which is good because I need a sax player. I need some horns up there. But, it is an odd movie. And I did like what I saw, but I haven't seen the whole thing. Again, I only saw it at CinemaCon, but I do want to go see it in IMAX. Binary Sunset says, I could really use some advice. I recently got an opportunity to train with professionals, and after a job with the volume stagecraft technology, this would mean relocating with the family. Well, you said you didn't ask me. You just made a statement. If you're asking me whether you should relocate, I think the volume technology is only going to get better, and it's going to be, I think, a vital tool moving forward, making, especially with science fiction, fantasy, and horror, we'll be using the stagecraft technology more and more and more. I'm still a big fan. I don't think it's entirely there yet. We can still see it. Like, if you know what to look for, it's pretty apparent what they're using. I understand, though, it's going to bring down the costs tremendously when you're making science fiction and allowing you to use, instead of using blue screen or green screen stage extensions, we can use volume technology, and it's only going to get better. So if you're asking me whether you should do it, I can't really tell you because I don't know enough about you and your family situation, but I would say this. If you have a good job that pays well and you can relocate to a place, I don't know if LA or Atlanta, because stagecraft is going to be used a lot, and the production in Atlanta is not going anywhere between Tyler Perry's studios and what Marvel's doing and what a lot of other people are doing in Atlanta. I would suggest going to Atlanta first rather than Los Angeles. That's just, quality of life is better, I think. Michael Strathmore says, you got to come to Toronto for TIFF some year. Yeah, I would love to if I had a movie I actually made. As a film buff, you'd love it. Best audiences ever. 22 films this year. My butt hurts, but my soul sings. Yeah, there's a lot of great stuff that came out of Toronto. I went to, 10 years ago, I worked on a documentary that played at Fantasia. And I love Canada. I love being up there. And Free Enterprise played in Winnipeg, and it played at in Edmonton. And then, of course, when we were working on Star Trek The Next Generation, when I hosted the 25th anniversary cast reunion, we did that in Calgary. And so I'm a huge fan of Canada. I'd love to come up. I've never been to Toronto. So, I really want to do that. But anyway, let's jump into tonight's topic. This, again, is an article that was in Slate 2 days ago. And I figured I'd write it. Deep Space Wine. There's a war over what is the real Star Trek, and it's highly illogical. This was written by Marissa Martinelli, and it was published on September 15th at 5 9:50 a.m. And, of course, this is Slate. What if we just did Star Trek? That, according to executive producer Henry Alonzo Myers, was the pitch for Star Trek Strange New Worlds, one of 5 new Star Trek shows to come out over the past 5 years as part of Paramount Plus's franchise revival. Though Myers may not have intended it, that Strange New Worlds pitch, what if we just did Star Trek, could easily be read as a rebuke to the rest of the current slate of Star Trek series. There are more Star Trek series running right now than there have ever been at any other point in the franchise history, and Star Trek's identity has never been more hotly debated. Accusing new installments of a franchise of somehow being illegitimate is a time-honored fan tradition, and Trekkies are not immune. The 50-Year Mission, Edward Gross and Mark A. Altman's 2-volume oral history of Star Trek, recounts decades of skeptics dismissing various iterations as not real. Fans of the original series balked at the very idea of the next generation. A new Star Trek without Kirk and Spock was highly illogical. Deep Space Nine was met with similar skepticism from the outset, with a class full of school children writing to co-creator Michael Piller to beg him not to distort Star Trek's vision by making it dark. Enterprise received voicemails from Trekkies enraged at how the writers had messed with the Star Trek canon. One just chanted, "Vulcans don't lie," repeatedly, and another sent them a box full of trash accompanied by a note reading, "This is what you've done to Star Trek." The first installment of the Trek Renaissance, Star Trek Discovery, was at even more of a disadvantage than most upon its premiere in 2017. Despite taking place shortly before the original series, Discovery's darkened aesthetics, serialized format, and modern sensibilities announced it as belonging to the 21st century and the streaming era. The characters say fuck. The technology was much more advanced than some viewers thought it had any right to be, and the show's star, a human sister Spock had never mentioned before, made it seem like the writers were stomping all over the canon. They were. The protagonist was also played by Sonequa Martin Green, a black woman, and despite the fact that imagining a more diverse future has always been part of its Trek mission, it's a mission that the worst of its fans aren't always willing to accept. Still, Discovery's biggest obstacle may have been its timing, premiering within days of another space travel show, The Orville. The Orville is not technically a Star Trek show. The Fox series uses none of the Trek IP, and the producers have made a point of listing multiple sci-fi sources of inspiration. But Star Trek is its obvious muse. Not only is creator and star Seth MacFarlane a known Trekkie, the show gained an air of legitimacy in fans' eyes thanks to a stable of Star Trek alumni working on it both in front of and behind the screen. The popular fan site TrekMovie.com even has a special section for it on its homepage. An episodic workplace comedy that mixed the allegorical sci-fi of classic Trek with the broad humor for which MacFarlane has become known, The Orville's first season offered exactly what the more complicated Discovery did not: levity, familiarity, ease. Comment sections and Reddit boards were quick to pit the two shows against each other, with The Orville anointed the real Trek. Let me be clear, I do not feel that way. I do not feel The Orville is real Trek, even though I will grant you it is absolutely inspired by Next Generation. Seth MacFarlane loved Next Generation, and mad props to Seth. We were allowed to interview him. He graciously gave us his time when we interviewed him for the Next Generation Blu-rays, and he agreed to come in and moderate our Inside the Writers' Room panel that is on the Season 3 Blu-rays. Now, I have to say, when he came in, now we did not ask him to do this, but when he came with a whole legal pad of questions, 20 pages deep. I mean, he is deeply devoted to TNG and took the situation that we placed him in incredibly seriously. And if you have the Blu-rays, which I highly recommend, if only to watch our special features, it's a very entertaining. It's Ron, it's Brannon, it's Nurin, and it's Renee Echeverria, and it's a great conversation, one of the best I think ever done in terms of creators and Star Trek. So check that out. Paramount Plus seems to have taken the criticism to heart. After Discovery and Picard, the series that saw Patrick Stewart return to his Next Generation character caught flack for being grim and unfamiliar, the showrunners changed course. In Season 3, the Discovery got a soft reboot so that it was no longer a prequel constrained by past lore, but a sequel set far into Star Trek's future and thus freer to experiment. Things lightened up considerably in the franchise with the introduction of Lower Decks, the terrific animated adult comedy created by Rick and Morty alum Mike McMahon, and Star Trek Prodigy, another zippy animated outing, this one for kids. Ironically, while all this was happening, the Orville, now moved to Hulu, grew darker and more serialized itself. And now there's Strange New Worlds, a prequel to the original Star Trek series of the 1960s that features young versions of already famous characters like Spock and Lieutenant Uhura. The crew of the Starship Enterprise wear the familiar red, yellow, and blue uniform color scheme that Leonard Nimoy and Nichelle Nichols used to back in the day. It's a return to the episodic storytelling format of the original series and of the Next Generation, made up of often wacky Planet of the Week adventures with some character development sprinkled in. Myers is right. It's just doing Star Trek. Well, see, this sentence, let me read this sentence. It's a return to the episodic storytelling format of the original series and of Next Generation, made up of often wacky Planet of the Week adventures with some character development sprinkled in. Myers is right. It's just doing Star Trek. That sentence is the single biggest problem with modern Star Trek. The people working on it, the people making it, everybody making it, thinks Star Trek is wacky. That's the word. It's not taken seriously. You go back, no one who is working on modern Star Trek watches classic, the original series, the 66 to 69 series. No one working on that show ever watches it and doesn't look at it through the lens of it being wacky. And that is the problem. There is an attempt since 2009 to change Star Trek, to bring it more in line with the sensibilities of the creators that are working on the show that don't really love Star Trek. They think they know, everyone thinks they know Star Trek. But unless you come from inside of what Star Trek is, you're only ever an outsider looking in. And the creative teams of Star Trek since 2009 have always been people that have been outside of Star Trek, and they have never been able to look inside and make it work entirely. That's why it's never worked. Star Trek has never worked. It's never worked. I don't believe it's ever worked since 2009. That's why J.J. Abrams, how many times have I said, watch any interview when he was promoting Star Trek 09. I didn't like Star Trek. It wasn't good. It wasn't something I liked. It was too intellectual. This is the man they had direct their most expensive Star Trek movie. Well, until he directed Star Trek Into Darkness, which was more expensive. But that's what we got. And that's what we've been getting from Star Trek. Now, I would say this, and I know I seem like a Paramount shill when I say this, but showrunner Terry Matalas is the first showrunner who's had carte blanche to do what he wanted with Star Trek Picard Season 3 that has actually been inside the franchise. And what I mean is that he is inside the Star Trek franchise, inside what Star Trek really is. He wasn't trying to change Star Trek and turn it into something else. He was trying to return Star Trek Picard to being it can't be entirely canonical because he had to deal with Star Trek Picard Season 1 and 2, but as canonical as it could be. And he made it from a position of being inside Star Trek, wanting it to be a legitimate continuation of Star Trek The Next Generation and Star Trek Deep Space Nine and Star Trek Voyager. There's ties to all of those shows. And without getting into it, and it feels like you're watching a Star Trek movie that takes place 35 years after the end of Next Generation. And that's why I like it so much, because I felt like, oh, somebody is not trying to change Star Trek into something else. They're literally trying to continue a storyline and extrapolate about what's come between 1987 and the end through Nemesis, and then continue on after that. Whereas if you watch Star Trek Picard Season 1 and 2, as everyone knows, I've said this a million times, you're watching a story that Patrick Stewart wanted to do. But Patrick Stewart's not inside Star Trek. He's an actor playing a character. And when asked, he's not going to tell you anything about Captain Picard. He'll tell you about Patrick Stewart. What does he want? What does Patrick Stewart, want to see these characters do? And this is the problem with the people that make Star Trek now. As Alex Kurtzman has said many times, I want to use the franchise for messaging of today? Well, when people start telling you that they have messages that they want to bring to you, the first question you should ask is, who are you to give me messages? Write a story, man. Write a great story. And the problem is, unfortunately, Star Trek's the very thing that Star Trek was doing in the 60s, which was offering inclusion and representation, it didn't say it was. It just did it. Because if they said it, they would have gotten in trouble. If they said, look, we're going to put a black woman on the bridge of the Enterprise and she's going to be part of the command crew, then someone would have bitched and moaned and complained. People did bitch and moan and complain, but it was stealthily done. Stealthily done, just like Rod Serling. Hey man, you can't tell these stories on television. Well, but if you put them in the context of an action-adventure science fiction show or a fantasy show, no, man, what we're telling is fantasy stories. They're allegories. They're like fables. We're not really dealing with the Vietnam War. We're not really talking about racism. No. These are science fiction stories. That was the whole point of Star Trek. Now, Star Trek beats you over the head with all of the social. Star Trek was always a social justice show. It was basically all about how everybody should be given a voice. Everybody is equal in the future. Everybody will have opportunity, and we will all work together. It's exactly that. But that was its baseline. That had already happened. You didn't have to talk about, they lived in a civilization that had contact with hundreds of different alien races. One of the main characters of the show was the product of a mixed marriage between two different species of humanoid. I'm, of course, speaking of Spock. What's more progressive than that? And the fact that he was a man of two worlds, not a part of either one. Look at Spock. Do you think that when they were creating Spock and they gave him a human mother and a Vulcan father, they weren't thinking about what was going on with intermarriages in the United States at the time? Of course they were, but they didn't have to come out and fucking say it. Pat me on the back because look what we're doing with our show. No, they just did it because they knew in the future that was just the way things were going to be. There's love everywhere in the galaxy. One of the great things that we have on this show, and we've talked about it a lot, and since it's late night, I'll throw it out as I take a drink. Let me ask you. Let's say you met an alien xenomorph, just like you saw an alien. And what if that alien xenomorph was one of the most compelling, interesting interesting xenomorphs or interesting beings you'd ever met? And what if you found yourself falling in love with an alien xenomorph? Would you fuck it? Would you get busy with an alien xenomorph? Could you? A lot of places to stick it. But would you? And so the question is, now on that spectrum of falling in love with an alien, where would you go? Vulcans, they're hot. Romulans, of course. Andorians, I'd certainly go there. But what on the spectrum of aliens, who would you love? I'm talking physical love. We talk about that a lot on the show. But that's a question to ask. And that's the progressivism, of Star Trek. You can deal with alien love. Now, you don't have to be patted on the back because you're showing Earth of today. Like, I guarantee you, like in the third season of Discovery, no one is going to be 1,000 years in the future when you are a spacefaring civilization and you've met hundreds of alien species. No one in the future is going to be worried about being non-binary and ask you to call them by their pronouns. But they do in the 32nd century on Discovery, and you ask yourself, this is a monumental failure of creativity. But anyway, let me go on with Strange New Worlds. Wacky Planet of the Week. Reviewers love it, and they can't resist taking digs at its predecessors amid the praise. At NPR, Glenn Weldon facetiously can't come up with the appeal of Discovery beyond space fungi, or heavily serialized storylines that have a tendency to get way more complicated than seems strictly necessary. Why can't they just make a normal Star Trek show anymore? Radio Times' Hugh Fullerton recalls thinking, before introducing Strange New Worlds as the answer. Hooray, Star Trek feels like Star Trek again, cheers Vulture's chat about Strange New Worlds, in which critic Angelica Jade Bastien calls Discovery and Picard Star Trek in name only. Discovery and Picard have their flaws, to be sure. Still, the very philosophy of just doing Star Trek strikes me as not very Star Trek. a franchise known for the credo of infinite diversity and infinite combinations. In fact, the most critically celebrated Star Trek series of all time is probably Deep Space Nine, for which eventual showrunner Ira Steven Behr's approach was explicitly, well, I don't care if it's Star Trek. Debuting while the then mega-popular Next Generation was still on the air, turns out a Star Trek without Kirk and Spock could work after all. Deep Space Nine was much darker than either of its predecessors, both tonally and aesthetically. It didn't take place on a starship, which led to a different style of storytelling. Not being able to leave the space station meant that the characters couldn't leave behind the consequences of their actions from week to week, and it was political in a way that went much deeper than Strange New Worlds' brief use of footage of the January 6th insurrection to illustrate Earth's strife, however much that particular scene might have irritated Fox News. Again, monumental failure of creativity on this part of Strange New Worlds. January 6th, that's ridiculous, because our past is not Star Trek's past. It's similar, but it's not the same, which is, I do not understand that. In Assignment Earth, when Gary 7 is there to prevent a nuclear platform from, or starting World War III or whatever, that never happened. I don't know why. There was no eugenics wars. I really don't understand why anybody thinks that our past exactly was Star Trek's past. It never was. And of course, they've been pushing the eugenics wars further and further and further out in Picard because, well, wait, we have to figure out why have they happened yet? Because Star Trek's past is not our past. God damn it. Why don't you get that? But anyway, what can you do? Let me finish this article. Amongst the most beloved of the Star Trek movies is a fish-out-of-water environmentalist buddy comedy that takes place, for the most part, not in the distant future, but in 1986. Another is a political thriller and Cold War allegory. I don't begrudge anyone their love of Strange New Worlds, which certainly has its charms, but a singular vision of what Star Trek can or should be is bad for Trek and bad for Trekkies. Is there anything more Trek than the mission statement that's been out there since the beginning? To explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life, and to boldly go where no show has gone before. And again, that article, let me get the woman who wrote it. Marissa Martinelli wrote this article for Slate. Now, you've heard me say, I've said so many times on this show my feelings about Star Trek, but Star Trek Strange New Worlds is New Coke. It might look like it's the Vegas show version of Star Trek. It is lightweight. It is a character. It is a show that's literally built around the charisma of one man and his merry band of babes that he takes with him. I mean, in a way, it's almost kind of a throwback because it's handsome Captain Pike and his hot women. It's such a weird. You have no sense of military discipline or decorum on that ship. Does anyone really pay any attention to their rank? Because everyone acts like they're just. It's another day at the office. There's no. I mean, it really does feel like the Vegas show version of Star Trek. Like, tonight at the Hilton, come see the hottest ticket in Vegas, Star Trek on the big stage. The colors, nothing looks believable. The whole thing looks like, and what's really interesting is that it looks like people from today looking back at Star Trek from the 60s, and it's wacky. And people think, okay, we're going to embrace the wackiness. No, the thing that they don't get is when Star Trek was on in the 60s, for the audiences of the day, it was futuristic. It was believable. You had a lot of people that were, Star Trek debuted 21 years after the end of World War II. And what, 10 years, a little more than 10 years after the Korean War? So Americans were very familiar with military decorum, discipline, all of those things. It was part of the fabric of our lives. Many of the people, Gene Roddenberry himself, were war veterans. So there was that sense that was imbued into the storytelling of Star Trek. All of that is gone. And anybody, which I find very interesting, because none of the people that are making modern Star Trek, you don't get a sense that there is any fealty to any kind of quasi-military organization at all. I mean, there's no authenticity to me in modern Star Trek. That's its identity crisis. Now, I'm not Mike McMahon and Lower Decks. you can't not watch Lower Decks as a Star Trek fan and smile. But again, it's easy. It's still, even though Mike McMahon loves Star Trek, like so many writers of comedy, they're not inside. They love it, but they're always outside of it. They're always looking at it from that humorous perspective. Let's make fun of it all. We love it, but we're above it. And that's what I feel about Lower Decks is, yeah, it's got all the Star Trek tropes and it's got all its fun and zip zap. Look, there's one thing about Star Trek fans. They love their humor. Fandom loves its humor. It always has, and it doesn't necessarily love sophisticated humor either. So I get it. A lot of people love Lower Decks. It's a lot of fun, I suppose. But to me, it's outside of the franchise. It's not inside the franchise. It's outside. It's always with a wink and a nudge. And what I am waiting for is I want to see, and I think all fans really, look, I do not begrudge anybody who likes Star Trek Discovery or Star Trek Picard seasons 1 and 2. I don't. I get it. I'm not going to sit there and say, there are people that their first experience with Star Trek is going to be Discovery, is going to be Picard, is going to be Strange New Worlds, is going to be Lower Decks, is going to be Prodigy, and they're going to have 56 now years of history to go back and delve into. The franchise speaks for itself. I don't have to speak for it. I don't have to defend, like all these people that come out, like, oh, the Star Trek, the original series is ridiculous. I don't have to defend it. History has already codified it. It isn't ridiculous. It has kept the franchise alive for over 56 years. So I don't have to defend the original series. It defended itself. So did Next Generation. So let's see. We've got, this is interesting. Lieutenant Commander Salinga sends in some tips. One reason for Trek's crisis is a worldly one. The easier paycheck. Roddenberry's Bibles made one thing sure. Writing and producing was not easy. Believability and allegory is challenging. Using known tropes isn't. Easier to write, produce, and consume too. You said Trek needs sci-fi authors. Well, I don't necessarily think Trek needs sci-fi authors. Trek needs people that have read science fiction. And Berman and Piller weren't. I think it needs educated authors. That's what I believe. Berman worked for the United Nations, visited 90 nations, made documentaries for kids in PBS, Big Blue Marble. Piller was a journalist and a censor. They knew of the real world, and because of that, they knew the value of the allegory storytelling of Star Trek, allowing to reflect on issues going in this world and provide a new perspective. Well, that wasn't good. I hope my dog just didn't kill himself. And because of that, they knew of the value of the allegory of storytelling of Star Trek, allowing to reflect on issues going in and on this world to provide a new perspective for conservative and progressive audiences worldwide. Trek needs these types. It is almost a dick move that Patrick Stewart first dismissed TNG-style storytelling for his series, since he described it in your moderated Blu-ray roundtable, how a policeman gained comfort and hope by watching The Next Generation. Mind-bogglingly ignorant and disappointing. Well, listen, I mean, I'm not going to diss on Patrick Stewart, but, I mean, I've told the story many times. When I interviewed Patrick Stewart for those Blu-rays, one of the first things I said to him was, I'm not going to ask you about Star Trek. And he laughed and he said, what do you mean? I said, well, if I were to ask you about the Battle of Narendra 3 and the geopolitical situation between the Romulans and the Klingons at that time, and what the loss of the Enterprise C meant to that what was going on at the time, what would you tell me? And he just laughed. He goes, I don't even know what you're talking about. And I'm like, exactly. And that guy, because of his power as an actor, was put in a position where he's designing stories for a show that obviously he was in, but he was outside of it. As much as it seems strange to say, he wasn't inside. He wasn't a Star Trek story guy. He got the stories and he played the parts. But if you were to ask him, you know, it's funny because like Andrew Robinson, who played Garrick, wrote a Star Trek novel, A Stitch in Time. He was inside Star Trek. One of the only actors that admitted to watching all the episodes of the show when we interviewed them was Michael Dorn. Michael Dorn watched every episode of Star Trek, and he could probably answer those questions. And by the way, for anybody who's interested, he kicks fucking ass in Picard Season 3. You will want to see him in another series stat as soon as you see the show. I promise you that. But anyway, the problem that I have with Star Trek, the identity crisis, so to speak, that it has, is all the people that are working on Star Trek are outside of that franchise. Now, I want to read another article about Strange New Worlds, because everyone's like, Strange New Worlds is great. Is Strange New Worlds great? Or is it based around a really charismatic guy and his hot lady crew? I mean, let's delve into this article. This is an article from Ars Technica. This was written back in May 5th. The latest Trek series plays it almost too safe, but it still feels right. If modern Star Trek shows have all felt a little off to you, Strange New Worlds may be what you've been waiting for. Now, let me just say, Strange New Worlds feels off to me. It really does. The modern era of Star Trek has been more than willing to experiment with what a Star Trek show is. Discovery and Picard both focus on heavily serialized season-long plotlines, which, by the way, Deep Space Nine was already doing back in the 90s. Lower Decks is an animated send-up of and love letter to Trek's cultural peak in the 90s, and the computer-animated Prodigy aims for a younger audience with simpler storylines, a lighter tone, and tweeny interpersonal melodrama aplenty. It's also not about human beings, which is something that I think that Star Trek needs to be about. It is inherently about humanity's place in the cosmos in the future. What none of these shows has explicitly tried to do is replicate the format of older shows like the original series or The Next Generation. Monster, alien, glowing godlike beings of the week stories where no matter how bad things might look for our heroes, everything will be more or less wrapped up at the end of the hour. Strange New Worlds faithfully follows the episodic template developed and perfected over many seasons of television and many hundreds of episodes of Trek shows of years past. And the result is a comfortable old t-shirt of a show. Familiar plotlines, storytelling beats, and crew dynamics quickly emerge over the course of the show's first 5 episodes, and Strange New Worlds is executing on all of it remarkably well. It's also by far the safest, most retready of all the new Trek shows, for better or for worse. A familiar old crew. Strange New Worlds benefits from the work done to establish Christopher Pike, the latest iteration of Spock, and Una #1 Chin Riley, Rebecca Romaine, in the second season of Discovery. Mount in particular has successfully cultivated a cool, hot space dad vibe for Pike that is nowhere to be found in Trek's original failed pilot turned cost-cutting flashback sequence. That they're speaking of the original pilot, The Cage, that was later turned into the 2-part TOS episodes, The Menagerie from the first season. That's right. The Captain Pike that we're watching in Strange New Worlds is nothing like the Captain Pike that was written and established by Roddenberry and Company when they shot that back in 1965. Even most of the new characters, Cadet Nyota Uhura, Nurse Christine Chapel, Dr. Mbenga, and Chief Security Officer Lan Noonien Singh, are either lifted from the original series or directly inspired by established characters. Because it's not starting from scratch, Strange New Worlds hit the ground running, avoiding the awkward first-season break-in period that most Star Trek shows suffer from as they attempt to fill in backstories and depict mind-bending sci-fi scenarios at the same time. Strange New Worlds picks up where Discovery left off, with few scenes to remind everyone exactly what happened on Discovery in the first place. Discovery's plotting is convoluted at the best of times, and any pre-pandemic television season feels as distant to me as the burning of Rome. Pike has glimpsed a grim vision of his own future and decides to carry on captaining the pre-Kirk Enterprise in spite of it. Why wouldn't he? He knows that nothing's going to ever happen to him on the Enterprise while he's there. So why wouldn't he? He could step off a cliff and he know it wouldn't have any consequences because nothing will happen to him, which is a really weird idea. Also stolen from a Star Trek novel called Burning Dreams by Margaret Wanderer Bonanno, but that's neither here nor there. After establishing that, though, the show makes only occasional nods in the direction of serialized storytelling, and most episodes follow a pattern that even casual Star Trek fans will recognize. A threat or unknown anomaly is introduced, the crew puzzles over the situation together in ways that help to establish their characters, and then the situation is resolved by some combination of diplomacy, phasers, and good old-fashioned know-how. Without spoiling any specific episode storyline, I can say that the first few Strange New Worlds episodes all deal with familiar Trek tropes, visiting alien planets in disguise, figuring out how to communicate with creatures the universal translator cannot understand, watching a strange disease spread throughout the ship, and engaging in a game of cat and mouse from inside a cloud of space dust. These are all competently executed, and they each conform to a type of Trek episode, even though nothing in them is as nakedly derivative of some early TNG episodes. Where Strange New Worlds feels best is in the quiet character interactions, the space where TNG, DS9, and Voyager found so much of their character and humanity. Discovery and Picard struggle to leave room for these kinds of interactions. The latter in particular, Discovery has gotten much better about this in the last couple of seasons. Both shows repeatedly fail my imagined Trek-specific version of the Bechdel test. Two characters have a conversation. It isn't about a reality-destroying super threat, and it's not because they both believe they're about to be killed in their quest to stop the reality-destroying super threat. Strange New Worlds lets these kind of lighter character explorations breathe in cold opens, B-stories, and throughout the entire episode. One episode has some strong Data's Day energy and is by far my favorite of the 5 screeners that have been released so far. What a relief it is to have a Trek series where low-stakes conflict and light hijinks can coexist with action and exploration. Now, I'm not going to read the rest of this article, but it's on Ars Technica, and I'm going to put the link in the chat, which I will do right now. My problem with all of this is that it's a copy of a copy of a copy. And here's the thing. Star Trek is supposed to be a reflection, or it has been, not supposed to be, it has been a reflection of the time in which it is made. Now, the original series, obviously the 60s, in the 80s, when Next Generation, they had a counselor on the bridge, which I thought was a good choice. And as the series moved on, especially beginning with season 3, it dealt with more storylines that were reflective of the time in which it was made, the 1980s. I don't feel, other than the overt political messaging that we're getting on the show, which is annoying as fuck, what we're getting from the show is a copy of a copy of a copy that's being made by people that are looking back at Next Generation and the original series. Again, they weren't inside the series. They're outside the series. They're coming in as interlopers with no necessarily a particular love of it. I mean, everyone likes Star Trek. Who doesn't like it? But were they students of it? In any other business, if you were going to hire somebody to work for you, you would want them to be incredibly knowledgeable about whatever product it is you were making. Star Trek, I would imagine, even more so than Star Wars, has more technical manuals, episode guides, concordinances, concordiums, whatever, than any other TV show or entertainment property ever made. Memory Alpha. I mean, it predated Wikipedia, I'll tell you that. How many fan blueprints, how many websites are devoted to the minutia of Star Trek? It's all been laid out for you. Hey, and certainly the writers of Strange New Worlds have known that because Una's backstory, number one's backstory, was lifted from Dorothy Fontana's novel Vulcan's Glory without attribution. One of the episodes this year was entirely lifted from Ursula K. Le Guin's book, Those Who Walk Away from Umlaus, which I've talked about before on the show. Not cool. But the problem with modern Star Trek is it's simply made by people that aren't particularly in love with Star Trek. I mean, that's the problem with the show. I mean, Mike McMahon loves Star Trek on Lower Decks. I will grant him that. I mean, I followed his season 8 tweets and everything. But again, he's doing it with, like, I'll give you an example. And I've said this before, all the time. I've said this before. You've heard me say it if you watch the show for any length of time. There are things in Star Trek, the original series, that are inherently goofy. They're goofy. I get it. And if anybody started watching Star Trek now and you'd never seen the original series from the 60s, and you get to the episode of Private Little War, and there's a creature called the Mugatu. Ben Stiller loves Star Trek, and he even has his in Zoolander, Mugatu, the villain, the villain fashion designer is named after the Mugatu creature in A Private Little War. What was that creature? It was a white ape suit with basically a big rhinoceros horn on the top of it. Now, because of the limitations, and Star Trek, by the way, was not an inexpensive show to make even in the 60s, despite the limitations, that's when you were watching that episode at the time, you didn't look at it and go, that's just an ape suit. I mean, maybe somebody did, but when I was watching it, that episode, you had a Canutu woman, you had a witch woman who was hot as fuck with her weird, roots, and cured when Kirk was attacked by the Mugatu. You're gonna die if this creature was played straight, and if it scratched you and scratched Kirk was gonna fucking die, and you needed a Canutu woman, Tyrese woman, Nona, to save his life. And it was all played very straight. Now, even someone like Mike McMahon, who's the Mugatu has been part of the show, they've taken everything and it's wing. Oh, we love the Mugatu, but it's all the goof factor is there. You don't take it seriously. They in Strange New Worlds, inexplicably, they have decided to make the Gorn the big bad of the show. The way they've treated the Gorn is ridiculous. They've ripped off Alien. They've turned the Gorn is this amazing spacefaring race that has they're technologically more advanced than the Federation, and yet they've been turned into literally a monster race. And even Akiva Goldsman's like, the Gorn are just evil. Well, in the first season of Star Trek, in the 66, 67 season, it was established that the Gorn were so much more than that. In 1966 and 67, the Gorn were portrayed, and I know, when you watch Kirk fight the Gorn at Vasquez Rocks, the Gorn moving very slowly. When we look back at that, I mean, the Gorn's in a TV commercial with Shatner. It's all a goof now. And I get that. There's been some great IDW comics where they made the Gorn not goofy. But they've leaned into the most, B-movie rendition possible of the Gorn. And it shows me, once again, the people that are making Star Trek are not inside the show. They're outside the show, and they're not taking it seriously. There's this air of, well, and here's what I can't abide the most. There is not an attempt to tell really meaningful, allegorical, science fiction stories that reflect our world in modern Star Trek. That's it. When I watch it, there's some great science fiction movies and science fiction. Like, I want modern Star Trek to tell stories the way Gattaca told the story, or the way Children of Men told the story, or the way Contact told the story, or the way Interstellar told the story. Now, I'm not saying that it can't be fun, it can't be humorous, but I want it to be elevated, man. Because when I was a kid, Star Trek elevated my life. It was smarter than me. Now, Star Trek is dumber than its audience. And that's the single biggest problem, the identity that it's having. Star Trek is dumb. Star Trek is repetitious. Star Trek is not unique. It's not adding anything. They're ripping off a TV show that they're not even inside of. They're ripping off the most superficial aspects of it without understanding that even the goofiest of Star Trek episodes had kernels of ideas in them. Now, I know, before you throw And the Children Shall Lead, And the Children Shall Lead is one of the worst episodes of science fiction television ever made. Not just one of the worst episodes of Star Trek. One of the worst episodes of television, Star Trek. It's so god-awful, you can't believe how god-awful it is. Really, really, really bad. And so my problem with the identity of Star Trek is that it is no longer smarter than its audience. The audience is way ahead of it. Now, I have talked a lot about that how I've experienced the upcoming Star Trek Picard Season 3. And what is it about Star Trek Picard Season 3? Why do I feel that it's such a breath of fresh air? And it really does. And no one believes me. I've taken a lot of shit. I was called a fat alcoholic lesbian looking motherfucker on Twitter the other day, and I was like, wait, what's wrong with lesbians? But which may or may not be true. But look, I hated Star Trek Picard seasons 1 and 2. Hated them with every fiber of my being. There was just a bunch of made up gobbledygook. The idea of how they treated the synths was was a sixth grade level of understanding at best. I hated everything about it. Star Trek Picard Season 3 is a return to form made by a showrunner that is inside this show, who is trying to take lore, characters. Now, look, they were already saddled with what happened in Star Trek Picard Seasons 1 and 2. But if you'd never seen Star Trek Picard Seasons 1 and 2, it would be like watching a Next Generation movie made after Nemesis 15 years later. Or now 20 years later. And that's what it is. It's like watching a brand new Star Trek movie over 10 parts. And I loved it. Is it perfect? Certainly not. But what is? But it feels like the best Star Trek movie that you'll ever watch. It really does. And it brings back the characters, man. It's character-based. It's allegorical. It refers back to the modern age. And it's the first time I felt I was watching, oh, this is what I've been missing. And if you don't take my word for it, that's fine. But half an hour into episode 1 of Star Trek Picard Season 3, the interplay between Picard and Riker will sell you. You'll be sold. You'll be sold by the end of that episode as well, and you'll be coming back after each episode, I promise you. But it's all about the characters. And you realize, gosh, I've missed this. This is Star Trek. Characters and story. So that's it. I mean, Star Trek's identity crisis. Hey, there you go. So take that as you will. Sonny Dominguez. Sonny says, God knows I shared too much last night. I saw Clerks 3 and like the latest Jay and Silent Bob film. It was a warmed over rehash of his previous films. Comedy fail. You know, it's interesting. So, Sonny, I can't. Last night's show is too long to edit, so I just took it down entirely. But I got to put it back up because people are bitching. But I'm gonna see what I can do about. Maybe I can download it and re-upload it or something like that and edit it myself. So, but I'm sorry that I wish that Jay and Silent Bob was better. John Wallbacher says that they couldn't talk about it was a bad thing. It actively hurt the careers of so many. That was something Roddenberry hated. Why are you longing for a time that sucked in our culture? Oh, I'm not longing for a time that sucked in our culture. See, here's the thing. I am not longing to go back to the 60s. I'm not longing to go back to a time when television standards and practices wouldn't allow you to talk about something. What I am saying is the show was extraordinary because even during that time, it was able to be excellent and address all of these issues that they said they couldn't address. Like you couldn't address the Vietnam War directly in a drama on TV in the 60s. But Star Trek did. In the second season episode, A Private Little War. I mean, it was Vietnam. You know how there was the Nazi planet, there was the Chicago mobs of the 20s planet. They went to Vietnam planet. Of course, they didn't call it that. And they told a story that network standards and practices would never have let them get away with. But hey, it was science fiction. So they were able to do it. I don't long to go backwards. In some ways, I think that the 60s was a smarter time than maybe today. I'm not saying we know a lot more, but are we as smart as we should be? I mean, that's the real question. Word balloon. John Suntress says, New Trek has no soul and doesn't realize its flaws. I totally agree with that. It doesn't. New Trek doesn't realize that it has its flaws. Terry Matalas, the showrunner of Star Trek Picard Season 3, certainly did. And he went a long way toward fixing those flaws. But you'll see. RRTNZ says, Hail, Bob. Strange New Worlds is a mixed bag. The writing swings wildly between decent, nearly Trek, and utter nonsense. Only Anson Mount's swagger carries it. I agree. I totally agree with that. Star Trek Strange New Worlds is a show where you're watching one very charismatic, handsome dude have a good time. You know, and it's really interesting because I think its greatest flaw is in its final. You can see it in its final episode. You know, where they do a riff on one of Star Trek's finest episodes, Balance of Terror, but this time Pike is in command of the Enterprise, and they basically replay Balance of Terror to the point where they're duplicating camera shots, but yet then they change things. Like, one of the great things about Balance of Terror was the relationship between Mark Leonard's Romulan commander and his Centurion. And it was great. That was probably one of the greatest Star Trek relationships ever, even though we only saw it in one, in terms of giving us insight into the enemy. And in Star Trek Strange New Worlds, they botched that completely. They changed it. And everything else was like they're trying to duplicate everything that was going on the bridge. But you go into the Romulan ship, and it's like, oh my God, the writing, epic fail. Epic fail. And it was really disappointing. Not just because Balance of Terror is one of the finest episodes of Star Trek ever made, but my God, we're going to like copy it. I mean, what a difference from the 30th anniversary episode of Star Trek, which was Troubles and Tribulations, and Deep Space Nine, where Deep Space Nine went back and they inserted our characters into footage from the original series. See, this is another problem that I think Star Trek has. Let's change it all. Let's not try and make it. We're going to have a prequel to the original series, but we're going to have uniforms that look nothing like Star Trek uniforms. Now, not to give anybody a hard time, but those Discovery uniforms are what the hell? Like, those first two seasons, what was going on there? And how does that fit in with Star Trek canon? And it's like, well, we don't need to fit in with Star Trek canon. Again, that's the problem. Eddie from Outer Space said, Star Trek Continues is more Trek than anything after '09, and it's great, too. I've watched it many times already, and I think it deserves more attention. Eddie's talking about the fan series, Star Trek Continues. A lot of it is quite good. It's a fan series that is an incredible recreation of the original series. But even then, Star Trek Continues was best when the writing was good. And I think there's some great episodes, but it's just a fan series at the end of the day, as good as it could be. But there are some great episodes, and they did some really interesting things with it. And I do appreciate what they did. Isaiah S. says, I love that we're getting Star Trek regardless. Isaiah, I am sympathetic to that point of view, but I would say that I want better Star Trek. And I think we are getting that from Terry Matalas in Star Trek Picard Season 3. And again, your mileage may vary, but I think it's readily apparent when you watch it what you're getting. You're getting a Star Trek movie. You're getting probably the best Next Generation movie you could possibly imagine, broken into 10 parts. It really does feel that way. But again, I leave that up to you. Cinema Gulp. Our friend Cinema Gulp says, who cares about J.J. Abrams anyway? The man has only one look, for Christ's sake. Lens flares, they're the same face. Doesn't anybody notice this? I feel like I'm taking crazy pills. Yeah, I mean, look, J.J. Abrams has made 4 science fiction films in 2 of my favorite franchises, and I haven't liked any of them. So I don't know. 200 Watt Studio says, I totally agree, Rob. The writers don't want to write a show to challenge people or themselves. I would guess the writers don't even like their own show. I think that there's probably some truth in that. I think there probably is a bit of truth in that, because look, I'm not saying that like writing television is hard. You have to be a talented writer. Gilbert, it's not my fault you knocked over something and you can't get out the door. But I just think that, look, if you watch the character interaction in Star Trek Strange New Worlds, if you're just having characters talk to each other, they speak in generic TV dialogue. It's generic. We're going to connect on an emotional level TV dialogue. That's what we're getting. And I can't stand that. It's like, okay, you're watching a science fiction show, and now we're in a generic relationship series that it could be from any TV show that's on. I'm sorry, Gilbert. He knocked over a bunch of stuff and blocked his way out of the house, or out of the Robservatory. Adrian Barraza says, hey, Rob, do you think Star Trek has not been as successful compared to Star Wars? Can it ever to that level? What needs to be done for that to happen? Well, that is a very good question. I mean, look, for all the Star Trek they're making, it's not. I'm going to have to, you know what I'm going to have to do? I'm going to have to get up and I'm going to have to let Gilbert out of the garage. If you will excuse me for a moment, I will be right back. Go ahead. You can go on. Go ahead. Go that way. Go on. Go on. Gilbert, you can go that way. Go. Gilbert, go that way. Go. Gilbert. You can go out now. Go ahead. Okay. Sorry about that. You know, when the dogs knock over boxes and block their way, you have to take care of them. So Adrian Barraza's question about do you think Star Trek has not been as successful compared to Star Wars? Well, first of all, Star Wars and Star Trek, just because they take place in space, you cannot compare the two. From a money standpoint, Star Wars has been wildly more successful than Star Trek. Always, in terms of box office grosses. Now, Star Wars was obviously a film franchise only until recently when it's come to TV. And obviously, it's anchoring Disney Plus. And look, I think that to a certain extent, Star Wars is suffering the same problem as Star Trek. Star Wars is 45 years old. It'll be 46 years old in May of 2023. And Star Trek just turned 56 years old. So the problem is there are things that everybody thinks they know. And now they're both controlled by corporate interests. And the thing is, it's not like Bad Robot went to Paramount or CBS back in the mid-aughts and said, "Hey man, we really love Star Trek. They took it. It's all business. Everybody that's running these franchises now, it's all business. Disney, Bob Iger bought Star Wars to exploit it for monetary gain. That's what it is. You know, when George Lucas filmmakers want to make money, obviously. But when filmmakers are making movies, they're not thinking to themselves how rich they're going to get making their films. They're concentrating on the stories that they're telling. They're concentrating on, hey, I had showrunner Terry Matalas on this show in the last episode. Terry Matalas was not making Star Trek Picard Season 3 because he wanted to get rich. You know, he was making Star Trek Picard Season 3 because he wanted to make a great season of Star Trek. That was his one and only concern. Sure, he wants to get paid, but he knows he's getting paid. He's getting paid working on the show. But, and I can't say what I know about it, but let me just tell you, there are things in the show that he fought for. You're going to be like, what the fuck? No way, dude. How did you do that? Because that's kind of how I felt about it. And he was willing to put up his own money for things that he didn't have to, but he was willing to. And No one else is going to do that. You're not going to see a Keith Goldsman go, yeah, it's like the old story when Gail Ann Hurd was talking about producing Aliens. The beginning of Aliens, when they find the Narcissus floating in space, and the salvage crew opens up the hatch with the laser torch, cuts the hatch open, and then the blue laser thing comes in, and the scanner that scans the inside. Gail Ann Hurd said, we don't have enough money to pay for that laser thing. Cameron paid for it out of his own pocket. James Cameron, no one who makes movies on that level is necessarily motivated by money. Sure, we all like money. But the primary motivation when because making movies is too hard, it's too difficult, it's too fraught with peril and risk. No one who's working on motion pictures is worried about the money. The people that are making great stuff. And look, yes, there are always exceptions, but for the most part, when you're making a movie, you just assume the money's there and you assume you're going to get paid. But what you're doing when you're making a film is you're in it, man. You're trying to make the best movie that you can. The problem with the people that have these franchises now is there are very few people in Hollywood that want to make Star Trek, if any at all. I mean, Terry Matalas, he started his career on Star Trek, working for Brannon Braga on Voyager and Enterprise. So he was coming home, and he's a huge geek. I mean, he likes Harry Potter. He likes Macross. He likes the animated series. I mean, he's one of us, and he's somebody who ascended to a position of power. I mean, if you want to see how talented he is, just watch the 12 Monkeys TV series. But the people that have taken on Star Trek, it was all of the people that have taken on modern Star Trek, all of them. I mean, what's funny is Bob Orsi, who was probably the biggest Star Trek fan of all, couldn't make that work and work within the business as well. I mean, it's tough. It's tough business. But there's nobody in Hollywood that aspires to take over Star Trek. They all want to make their own shit. And that's the problem. I mean, you look at a guy like Kevin Feige. Kevin Feige's great success comes from the fact that he loves what he's doing. He worked on 14 Marvel projects before he made the MCU. And he loves this shit. He lives, and the article that I was reading that I posted yesterday about Comcast maybe buying Warner Brothers. It's really sad because David Zaslav doesn't love movies. It's all business for these people. And the problem is these old venerable franchises, there's going to be no one. The problem is that there's so much money at stake that the very people that you would want to be in charge of these franchises will never do it because they're never qualified enough for the money people to give them the job. Like, people have always said, well, Rob, you could run Star Trek. No, I couldn't run Star Trek because, one, I don't have the professional credibility to do so. I've never worked in television. I've never had to oversee an episodic television show. I don't have any skill set to do that. Now, I could be a creative producer and be in charge of the content, and I can oversee post and all that. But could I run a day-to-day television show? I could, but if it wasn't Star Trek, I could. But Star Trek I would not be a good person to do that. I would be a good person to work with the writing staff and to work in post and to be creative. I would be good at. But I mean, it's like Dan Lin not taking the DC job at Warner Brothers. If this whole thing is a setup where they can sell Warner Brothers in April of 2024, when all this rigmarole is done, and they sell off Warner Brothers, it'll be one of the great tragedies in American history. And I mean that. I mean, when I say tragedies, are great artistic tragedies in American history, I should say. And if that's really what they're planning on doing. And it would be such a shame. And I mean, it's too bad. But anyway, I'm kind of getting off track. The question, I don't think I don't think that Star Trek has been nearly as successful as Star Wars on any level. There hasn't been the movies haven't been as successful. The TV shows haven't been nearly as successful. I mean, for Paramount Plus, based on their numbers, the amount of subscribers they're getting, I guess they're getting some kind of success from it. But where's your merchandising? Are people clamoring for the? I mean, look, I'll tell you this. I have not wanted to get a model kit of a Star Trek spaceship from any of the new shows, and I got spaceships coming out. I got Star Trek spaceships all around me You know, all around me in here, there's so many starships are in this Robservatory everywhere. There are none. I mean, okay, someone's going to say, Rob, you have that model, the Revell model of the Star Trek '09 Enterprise. That's true. But I bought that. I don't know why. But yeah, I there's a couple of starships I want models from Picard Season 3, including a tasty adversary starship that I would really like to see hanging from my ceiling here. But yeah, Star Trek. Look, Star Trek is not. Star Wars is mass appeal. Star Trek is niche. It always has been. It always will be. Star Trek is not a mass appeal for quadrant show. When Star Trek is what it's supposed to be, it's niche. You know, it's always been that way. And Star Trek, you know what? I don't understand why Star Trek isn't Breaking Bad. I don't understand why it's Better Call Saul. I don't understand why it's not Game of Thrones. And I don't mean serious and full of crime and violence. I mean in terms of that level of writing. The people that are writing Star Trek now should be writing the best fucking sci-fi television has ever seen. And instead, we are getting sophomoric level at best gobbledygook. That is a copy of a copy of a copy. That is people from the outside trying to recreate something from the 60s that they think is silly in the first place. But hey, let's make it fun and palatable so it goes down easy. Scrumptious, supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. That's the Star Trek we're getting. RRTNZ says Leonard James Akar for president. Yeah, the high tier, man. Friday's Child, season 2. A great episode. Uchi Woochie Coochie Coo. Uchi Woochie Coochie Coo. Yes, that's right. Even in an episode of Star Trek with the Klingons, you can have Spock and McCoy have that exchange. That's why Star Trek's great. Binary Sunset Media says also they aren't adding anything original. TNG barely used TOS aliens or referenced episodes. That's right. I mean, okay. Here's another thing. First of all, why didn't they use Roddenberry's story Bibles? Second of all, you make a great point. Aside from McCoy, Dr. McCoy being Admiral McCoy in Encounter at Farpoint, they did have the Naked Now. They would give you an occasional reference in a line of dialogue to Star Trek history. Not very much. The first time you saw another Star Trek character appear was Mark Leonard playing Sarek, Spock's father, in the 3rd season episode Sarek, that was based on a story by Peter S. Beagle, a fucking great fantasy writer. And so that was amazing. And that's another thing. In Next Generation, you see Mark Leonard as Sarek. So when you're seeing other people playing Sarek, it feels inauthentic. And all they've done is they keep giving us, how many Spocks have we had? How many Sareks have we had now? Why are they doing that? You know, it's such a weird thing. In Star Trek, the characters got to grow old and die. And that was a part of the fun, is this lineage of characters. And going back in time, I don't know. They aren't, yeah, and so Binary Sunset, you're absolutely right about that. 200 Watt Studio says, tonight I watched Imprint, that's the Australian label, Imprint's new Blu-ray of The Strange Love of Martha Ivers. Judith Anderson from Star Trek 3 was the Ivers matriarch. Dame Judith Anderson, who played the Vulcan priestess. What you ask has not been done since ages past. The Faltor Pan, the Refusion. Yeah, that's cool. I've never seen that movie, The Strange Love of Martha Ivers. I would watch that. Boat says, man, maybe it's okay for things to end. Maybe Star Trek didn't need to be continued. I think I'd be happier nerd-wise if Star Trek and Star Wars were at rest. Well, you know, here's the thing. We are one show away from our favorite franchises being great. Looks like Andor is great. I know that Picard Season 3 is great. So as long as we can get something great. And you know what else? Here's the cool thing about Star Trek Picard Season 3. It takes our characters and moves them forward in time. And it feels right. They're not all the places you might think they're going to be. You know, it's surprising. But it's like, okay, we are down the line with these characters. And how interesting that this is where we're at. And that's another thing that Star Trek had over all these other franchises. Starting in Star Trek '09, when you started going back and having other actors play these characters, the whole point of Star Wars or Star Trek, what they had done that was so clever, was they were pushing the franchise forward. I mean, I didn't think Enterprise was the best idea in the world because it was made by two guys that didn't necessarily, ironically, I mean, Brandon Braga didn't love Star Trek. It was a great gig. He's making a lot of fucking money. And Rick Berman certainly did too, but they were two guys that they co-created Enterprise and they wrote a lot of those episodes. And they might not have been the greatest people to do that. And again, they had to deal with more network interference than Star Trek ever had to deal with before. So it was a different thing. But hey, look, we're one step away from greatness, always. So that's pretty great. I mean, and we're going to get great Star Wars next week, and we're going to get some great Star Trek in February of 2023. So yeah, I don't want it to end, because Star Trek, the thing is, Star Trek is always, even when it wasn't on the air, it had comic books, it had novels, it had all kinds of things. Reference books were coming out. I mean, there's been Star Trek product that's fueled my love of Star Trek for a long time. So it doesn't necessarily have to end. It could just be good. Why not keep things going if they're good? Eddie from Outer Space says, thoughts on the new brick-based Star Trek models from Blue Bricks. I don't have them, and I've only seen them once. Let me look. I wish it was Lego. I don't understand why it's not. They've never been able. That's another thing. Merchandising. XO6 is doing a great job. Now I've seen this. Oh, these are cool. I mean, yeah, I don't know about this. The Enterprise D is okay. I do like this Runabout. The Runabout looks great. Deep Space Nine looks pretty great. I wouldn't mind getting those. Those look pretty good. The Bird of Prey is cool. The Delta Flyer has been announced. That's cool. Huh. These are cool. I got to look into these. Some of these are neater than others, but some of them look cool. Maybe I will look into that. Again, I just wish it was Lego. So, anyway. We have Sonny Dominguez says, don't worry about editing out anything I said. Time for me to be bold, so let what is. After all, if you cannot laugh at yourself and openly share with people, what's the point? Now I've got Tallulah barking. I mean, it's not like I fell asleep in my chair. Touche. Michael Nemo says, I will do that. I'll reinstate that episode. Rob, I have a theory. Never let an actor take control of their character or the story. Patrick Stewart and Leonard Nimoy are two examples of actors having terrible ideas with regard to the direction to go with the story of their characters. I'm sorry to say I tend to agree with that. I mean, there have been actors that have been great directors and great storytellers in the past. But I think in the case of that, I think you're right. Sebastian, I'm live and you are getting rid of I have 3 dogs and they love me and they don't like it when I'm not paying attention to them, and they like to come in here because I give them treats. But I think that's correct, and I think that, look, the problem is there would have been no Star Trek Picard unless you allowed Patrick Stewart to define the story that he wanted to tell. Otherwise, he wouldn't have done it. And a lot of actors, especially actors that thought a part of their lives was done. And he's a Shakespearean trained actor, and I don't have any particular insight into this, but I can only imagine that Patrick Stewart probably would rather go out not on another season of Star Trek, which he did starting in 1987, but something maybe on the Shakespeare stage, or something that something that's a little bit more highbrow. I mean, I can only imagine that might have been something that interested him. So, but hey, he got paid. But yeah, actors will always do what serves them. They want to do things where they are made to look great, and being on Star Trek isn't necessarily Patrick Stewart's dream, nor was it Leonard Nimoy's dream. Again, in a way, Patrick Stewart and Leonard Nimoy are prime examples of men that wanted more. And I love Leonard Nimoy. I got to go to his house and meet him and all that, and I really loved Leonard Nimoy. He was very talented photographer. He had other interests other than Star Trek, but he was trapped his whole life. And he wanted to be able to do other things. And he tried to, 3 Men and a Baby, and The Good Mother he directed, he did his photography books like Shekinah. He did all of these things, but it was what the public wanted from him was Star Trek. And to a certain extent, Patrick Stewart as well. But I think Patrick Stewart wants to be Ian McKellen. And, going back to Star Trek is not, it's niche. It's not populist. I mean, Professor Xavier is more popular, I think, than worldwide might be more popular than Patrick Stewart. I mean, I don't know. I'd hope not, but I probably think. I don't know. Emma Bannon, the lovely Emma Bannon, says, Rob, by the way, Emma, that UFO book, oh my God, I've wanted a book like that since I was a little kid. And that Space 1999 book you sent me is really interesting. Emma Bannon says, Rob, what would you say defines good Star Trek? Is it the lightsabers or the robots? You're cute. It's a good question. By the way, Emma Bannon knows the difference. She's just making some of her jokes, which we all know around here. They're terrible, but delightful at the same time. What makes great Star Trek? I think what makes great Star Trek is something that makes any kind of great science fiction. You want stories, allegorical action-adventure stories that are about a imagined future where humanity hopefully will wind up, that also relates back to where we are today as a people. Star Trek inherently has to be optimistic. We are going to get through our trials and tribulations and make it into the future. And we are going to move out into the cosmos and take what we've learned as a species and hopefully meet new challenges and expand our horizons. I mean, as they say at the end of Star Trek the Motion Picture, the human adventure is just beginning. And that is at its core, that's what Star Trek is about. It is about the human adventure. It's about retaining our humanity against the cosmic infinitude and whatever is out there. And how are we going to meet those challenges? And how are those challenges going to profoundly change us and yet still allow us to retain our core humanity? That's what I think a good Star Trek story does, if that makes any sense. Let's see. Let's go back. People are firing in more super chats. Tony Reyes. Hello, Tony Reyes, you PGS hero. How are you? Rob, which would you pick? Keaton's Batmobile, or Speed Racer's Mach 5? Speed Racer's Mach 5. All day, every day, and twice on Sunday. The Batmobile can't maneuver. The Mach 5? Come on. The Mach 5 can go underwater. I'd take the Mach 5 any day. And the Mach 5 would smoke the Batmobile on an open straightaway. Doomed, huh? Says Lower Decks is oddly the only show that feels like the writers have seen Star Trek. Oh, they've seen it, but as I said, they look at it and the writers think they're better than Star Trek. I have many friends, they're comedy writers, you know how that is. John Weilbacher says, what's this? A way to add more modern Trek love to your show and support you? Well, here we are. I love most of modern Trek, and I feel like some stuff in Strange New Worlds and Disco are great additions to the series. Well, I mean, I guess that's good. I would question as to what those things are. I would ask you what do you think? What are those additions that are great additions to the series? 200 Watt Studio says, The Strange Love of Martha Ivers, starring Kirk Douglas, Van Heflin, Elizabeth Scott, and Dame Judith Anderson, part of Imprint's Noir Collection number 3. They're doing some great stuff. Please, Tallulah, stop licking me. They're doing great stuff, and there's a lot of stuff I just put in my cart that I need to go buy, which I think is great. But yeah, I should get their Noir collections are great. Boat says, off topic, but what do you think of The Expanse? I'm fascinated by the aliens in that universe, and it tickled my Star Trek brain like crazy. I love The Expanse. I mean, talk about a show that does representation correctly. Without, again, it's just the way things are. It's just matter of fact, and it's great stuff. I love The Expanse, although I thought, I thought the last two seasons kind of petered out a bit. But yeah, the unseen aliens, the proto-matter technology and all that, very, very interesting. And it doesn't, they get into it. I mean, I really hope they do the next 3 seasons. It would really be great. Yeah. I would love them to do that, but I do love The Expanse. I think it's great. RRTNZ, question 4, Bob, Stewart or McKellen, better actor? Ian McKellen. I love Patrick Stewart, but Patrick Stewart is too mannered. Ian McKellen can play. Look at Ian. Go watch Richard III. McKellen's Richard III. I think that Patrick Stewart is a really, really good actor. But it's interesting. I don't think he is top tier. And maybe because he's never been given a leading role that wasn't part of a franchise like that. I mean, he was really good in A Christmas Carol, but I still think he was a little too mannered. Whereas Ian McKellen, he's just had more parts, more diversity. He's had a lot more screen time than Patrick Stewart had. And I think maybe if Patrick Stewart had more opportunities doing different things, then he might have been able to stretch more as an actor. But I still like Patrick Stewart, but I think Ian McKellen blows him away. John Wildbacker says, it would take more than the space I have here in a super chat to give you detail on what has been great in modern Trek. Maybe I'll hang back for Midnight Musings and we can get into it. Well, John, write me a letter. Write me a letter to read here on the show and about what you think is great on modern Trek. I promise I will give you a fair shake. Motassim asks, your honest opinion on She-Hulk. It's my least favorite MCU project at the moment. The writing is just so disappointing and McClunky for me. Listen, Motassim, I'll tell you, I've enjoyed watching She-Hulk, but again, ultimately I find the writing, it's interesting because I enjoy watching it. I have fun watching it, but the writing is not good. And look, I think that's what's plaguing a lot of our franchise material. I think the writing in the MCU movies has been, for those movies, been pretty stellar. Marcus and McFeely have done great work, but I think the TV shows have definitely suffered. I think the writing on almost all of the Marvel, I mean, I thought WandaVision was probably the best. WandaVision was the best show, and I did like Falcon and Winter Soldier, but it was compromised in production. But yeah, I'm unfortunately, I have to agree with you. I think the writing is not as good as it should have been. I was expecting something far more sophisticated and smart than what we've got. Stub McShave says, how many books, Blu-rays, and figures have the dogs eaten? You know what? They've not as many as you might think. I think I've lost like 4 or 5. I lost 4 or 5 Blu-rays and a couple of 4K discs when Gilbert was a puppy. He ate a lot of things. And there was a couple of books, but not much. They just knock stuff over here because, I'm still not quite all moved in here and there's a lot of boxes, so it's hard for them to maneuver around it. So I have stacks of boxes and they rush by things and stuff falls over. But not as many as you might think. So, yeah. Well, listen, everyone. I think I'm going to draw an end to this episode of Robservations. It was fun. I enjoyed a lot of great interaction. I want to thank everybody for being here and supporting the channel via Super Chats and Tips. We are going to bring back the members chat next week. Hopefully Saturday, if I don't have to do a Designing Hollywood, but tentatively for those people who are channel members. I love our member chats. They're so much fun. We're going to do one next week for sure, whether it's Saturday or Sunday. Mostly Saturdays. I like to do Saturdays, but hopefully we will... I'll be able to tell you sometime during the week. Of course, I'll be on the John Campea show. And then all of our after shows. Andor starts this week. Very excited about Andor. We got House of the Dragon episode 5 tomorrow when all hell, I assume, is going to break loose, which is going to be terrific. But yeah, Boat sends in another super chat and says, I can't watch live again for quite a while, so I will leave you with one question. Where are the nuclear vessels? Well, you know where they are. They're in Alameda. That's where the nuclear vessels are. How great is it? Star Trek 4 on 4K. Very, very exciting. So that's all good. But yeah, thank you all for being here, all of you imagination connoisseurs. I have many letters to read, so if you've sent me in letters lately and I haven't read them, I will get around to reading them, and we will be doing that next week as well. Robservations will probably be on around 8 o'clock. I'm going to do 8 o'clock at night Pacific time, so we'll do more. But on that note, remember, every person you meet has a story to tell that you have yet to hear, and all you have to do is listen. I want to thank my moderating staff, Tom Jr. Jackson, for being here, for moderating. He is a goof person. He made up that phrase, and we're happy to have him. I feel lucky to have him, and I want to thank everybody for supporting the channel. And on that note, I will wish you all good night, and I can't wait to watch House of the Dragon tomorrow. There is no Let's Get Physical Media until next week. We'll see you back then.